Hello and welcome to the FNAF Book Club. I'm Kathuras, and tonight I'll be your host. Please note this video contains spoilers for the Fazbear's Frights, Silver Eyes trilogy, and Tales for the Pizzaplex novels. Also, all thoughts expressed here are my own, and by no means undeniable and absolute fact. I make no claim this is the case, I do this for fun, just like anyone else. In this video, we'll be taking a close and in-depth look at GGY, which is the first short story in the fifth Tales for the Pizzaplex novel. Even before this story came out, I was very invested in it. As people might already be aware, I spend a great deal of my free time playing Security Breach, cataloguing interesting sites, and doing my own long plays of the various versions of the game. So I, of course, had noticed the arcade machines scattered throughout the game with GGY sitting comfortably as the top scorer. I assumed, hopefully logically, that these initials belonged to our Gregory from the game. This assumption came with a number of questions attached. If Gregory has had time to play almost every arcade in the place, then surely this must not be his first night in the Pizzaplex after dark. Also, why is he so good at arcade games? I was optimistic we might get some hints, if not full answers, in this short story, and was excited to read it. Unfortunately, the book leaked well in advance of its release date, and I have no interest in relying on other people for my book, so I had to spend a rather unpleasant period of time avoiding people talking about it, which wasn't very fun. But now it's out, I finally have it in my possession, and I'm excited to go over it with y'all. So, let's begin in the obvious place, with an overview of the story itself. Tony Becker's our main character, a boy who's a budding journalist and who wants to understand life's little mysteries. He bites off more than he can chew when he tries to bring some real life fact into a school creative writing assignment. Tony's friends, both going by their pen names Dr. Rabbit and Boots respectively, aren't much interested in working on it right away, so the group goes to the Mega Pizzaplex instead. There, Tony, also going by his pen name Tarbell, finds the inspiration he needs for his assignment in the arcade machines in the Fazcade. He decides he wants to find the truth behind the elusive GGY, whose initials top many of the high scoreboards and whose scores dwarf anyone else below where he appears. What ensues is Tony's attempt to understand more about the identity of GGY. However, the more he finds out, the deeper the rabbit hole seems to go. Digging for clues, he consults two pinball queens at the Fazcade for advice. They send him to speak to Axel, the resident high scoreboard expert, and he later confirms with Finbar, one of the arcade staff, that GGY has not been hacking the machines to obtain his scores. His progress on his research is watched over by Glamrock Freddy, who is not behaving at all as he should. In the process of trying to learn more about GGY, Tony steals a lanyard from a staff member and looks into the Pizzaplex databases, where he finds that GGY has full employee access to the property and has brought three individuals with obscured names to the property using his modified keycard. He digs further, reaching out on online forums where he meets Morrigan99, who turns out to be one of the girls he consulted for clues earlier. She warns him strongly against looking further into events, saying that GGY has been hacking the animatronic behaviours and could be plotting sinister things. After this encounter, Tony overhears a report on the news of a school counsellor going missing, whose name lines up with one of the individuals GGY brought to the Pizzaplex. Ignoring the warnings from Morrigan, Tony sneaks into school at night and checks their records, finding not only does one name line up, but all three names he saw in the database appear to be vanished counsellors. He hands over his work to his friends to add their piece to the essay before turn-in, and the next day he's devastated by changes to his reports on the mysterious GGY. The work has been rendered quite silly by their additions, but so close to the deadline he has no option but to turn it in as is. Later that day, Tony's called to the principal's office and strongly reprimanded for sneaking into the school, even though Tony is sure he wasn't filmed or followed during this incursion. Attending detention in the library and upset about what happened, Tony's visited by his once friend, Dr. Rabbit, who, in his irritation, he thinks of by his real name now. Dr. Rabbit, or rather, Greg, says he's sorry and invites Tony to the Pizzaplex, where he says he has some people there who he'd like him to meet. The story follows a traditional mystery format, but we're not provided with the closure of an ending or what happens to Tony, which leaves this story, like others in the series, relatively open-ended. The overview I've provided does omit various smaller subplots and characters, but I hope it gives a framework of understanding for what we're talking about here. Nothing really beats reading the text for yourself. As a mystery story, GGY is absolutely teeming with characters. I counted at least 28 in my research for this video. For this section, I'll try and focus primarily on the central figures first of all, along with my thoughts on who they might parallel or represent. Our main character is Tony Becker. Tony is not an overly likeable protagonist. He has strong opinions on what he wants to do in his life, can make assumptions about others and their home lives without much evidence, and does not think very highly of his peers and friends. I would say there's something of the archetypal hard-nosed detective or investigator in Tony. He's just a lot younger than we normally see this character appear in literature. Tony sees himself as similar to Ida Tarbell and names himself accordingly, deliberately avoiding a fairy tale or fantasy name like his peers, but finds himself dubbed Tinkerbell instead by Boots, much to his annoyance. Tony's main drive for what he does is tied back to his father, who was imprisoned around half a year ago for embezzlement at his job. He was an accountant for a large corporation and hundreds of thousands of dollars went missing. However, there's an implication in the story, and in Tony's mind, that his father might not be the one actually to blame for what happened, and there may have been someone more dangerous behind it all. However, his father warns Tony in the memory to drop it and makes him promise that he would. Unable to find out what happened, Tony becomes more determined as a consequence to unravel other mysteries that he encounters. As a character, Tony unquestionably reminds me of Sammy, Henry's son. Now, you might argue we literally never see Sammy in the games at any point, and I would agree that yes, we almost never see him appear by name in a literal sense. However, his shadow hangs heavily over the games, novels, and short stories. He's present in the Negative Spaces series, and I personally consider there to be a fairly consistent archetype character in the literature that we see who fits the absent son. I'll go into these characters as we reach them in the series in depth, but for now I'll try and give some degree of overview on what we see. So the Sammy archetype is typically highly intelligent, concerned with mysteries or conspiracies, with a father who is sometimes missing as Henry is in the main games, either in a permanent sense or just for the context of the story. The most potent signifier of this particular character being in play is when we're presented with twins. Twins in the series are often presented as a pair of geniuses. The most typical example of this pair are Shelley and Pickle in The Breaking Wheel, who I also consider to represent Charlotte and the game absent Sammy. I just want to reiterate that this is not a character conclusion I've come to lightly. There are many examples of this character littered throughout the Frights and Tales, and though Tony is a more subtle example, I still think that's who we're looking at. I hope that I'm afforded more opportunity to expand upon this as we go. Under this Sammy assumption, there's a new depth given to Tony's conversation with Crystal later on, who, as you'll also see, I consider to represent Charlotte in this story. When asked why she'd help Tony out, she considers him and says the following: "I have a little brother, and I would have felt like a jerk if I didn't tell you what I know and warn you to be careful." She raised her hood. "Now I've done that." This statement to me feels out of place on a gut level for the scene and the relationship of these two characters in the story. But extended out into additional context with Charlotte and her brother she was lost to, this parallel with the game story we know is significant. This assumption of character parallel also contextualises Tony's father and his lingering criminal conviction as a potential nod to Henry. Henry is still to this day suspected in the murders at Freddy's, though never convicted for it. Was Sammy warned in the most strenuous terms not to investigate his father's guilt and sister's death, the way Tony was warned never to look into the embezzlement? I think this is an interesting thing to speculate. Tony lives with his solitary mother, who's fallen on hard times, and lives with her own mother. We know for the Silver Eyes trilogy that Sammy lives with his mother, and that they left together when Henry fell into madness. On its own, this fact is not remarkable, but seen together with the other consistent facts, this also casts a clearer light on who we might be looking at a parallel of here. Of course, my thoughts are not the be-all and end-all on this character. Tony's investigations might represent one of the detectives in the story, such as Larson, in a more literal sense. They might represent Michael's search for the truth about his father. Arguments could be made for a number of parallels, and all of them would be valid. Just for myself, after considering what information that we have, I think we are once again looking at Sammy. Tony's two best friends are relevant to the story, with Boots being his oldest friend. Ellis, who goes by Boots for the majority of the story, was inspired by Puss in Boots for his pen name and is presented as a laid-back kid who's not overly bright. He has dark hair, green eyes with a wiry frame and smiles often. We perceive Boots through Tony's eyes, and Tony seems to be rapidly outgrowing his friend, stating that sometimes it felt he was content to stay a little boy while Tony moves on in his life. He's far more interested in his newest friend, who seems to have depths that Boots does not possess. As a character, Boots is a bit of a mystery to me. There are a number of characters for the wider canon he could potentially parallel, such as Andrew or Cassidy, who seem to never grow up in some regards. But I don't feel like we see quite enough of Boots to get a real grip on if he's a parallel character or simply a wholly original side character. Tony's other friend is known for the bulk of the story as Rab, or Dr. Rabbit. We don't find Rab's real name, Greg, out until the very end of the story, and it's framed very firmly as a reveal when we do. Rab is described as incredibly small, pale, and often frail looking, but with large brown eyes that could make him look like a kid. In spite of having hair he cuts himself, which looks that way, he's described as cute by some of his peers. Rab interests Tony, who catches glimpses of something deep and intelligent beyond the side of the other boy who likes to cut up and goof off. Tony considers Rab more interesting than Boots. He states that he had a feeling Rab had layers that Boots would probably never have, and catches him with rigid or unreadable expressions on several occasions. Tony assumes Greg is from a well-off family, but there's subtle implication that Tony doesn't actually know all that much about him. He doesn't know what he does on Sundays or why he's not around at the weekend, shrugging it off as he'd never asked and Rab had never said. If I could, I would ask Tony if a wealthy kid would have to cut his own hair. With the incredibly strong implications that Rab is GGY in this story, some of his comments are thrown into a more sinister light on a revisit. He warns Tony early in the story, "You think too much. That's bad for your health." His identity also explains why he doesn't read Tony's essay when he's with him, but files it away in his bag immediately. The parallel for Greg is, I believe quite clearly, Gregory as seen in Security Breach. He has overlapping elements of appearance alongside the shared name. It's worth mentioning a shared name and appearance in the context of the short stories does not always mean a direct correlation between two characters. But I think the addition of the high scores and an intensely accurate, though subtly deviating Pizzaplex tell us that we're looking at a parallel with our version of Gregory. We also see one of my favourite little turns of phrase in this short story, one that I think often nods to us that the story's tied closely to the Afton family and the games in general. This phrase, for the popular song The Afton Family, is "always well," and the exact quote this time is as follows: "1 second, always well. The next second could bring surprises of the worst kind." Needless to say, Greg is a very important character in understanding this story. Tony meets a few significant characters in the Fazcade during his investigations into GGY's high scores. The first of these is Crystal, also known as her initials CRF, and her forum handle Morrigan99. She's one of the two competitive girls playing pinball at the arcades. She's around 15 or 16 years old and is distinguished by a long braid. She also has large teeth and dark eyes. At first, Crystal is somewhat unhelpful to Tony, showing little direct interest in his queries. This changes when he continues to press forward in his investigation, and she calls him to meet her to warn him about what he's getting into. She's strong-willed but fundamentally indifferent to other people's problems, concerned only with her own interests. She's a hacker who hacks simply out of curiosity and states that her own agenda has nothing to do with GGY. The character that Crystal most clearly and directly parallels to me is Charlotte. To specify, when I say Charlotte, I encompass all representations we have of her character, including Lefty and the marionette. Much like Sammy, Charlotte is a character archetype which appears frequently in the short stories. Crystal's personality aligns with what we know about Charlotte, where the marionette states to William and UCN that "I don't hate you, but you need to stay out of my way." This is a very indifferent attitude to take to her murderer, and gives the shape of her potential personality in the broader games. As previously stated, the parallel with Sammy is also relevant in confirming who Crystal is best paralleled with. Another factor which ties Crystal to Charlotte is her chosen forum handle. I'll go into more depth on this later, but the brief summary is that the Morrigan is deeply entwined with crows and ravens. This is something that she has in common with Charlotte within the series. There are numerous examples of this in the Frights and Tales, but the one that springs most readily to mind is from the novel trilogy. In the dying moments of the first novel, Charlie recalls a memory with her father where she was just a child. Both of them were sitting behind Fredbear's looking out over the hills and a crow landed nearby. Charlotte was immediately enamoured with it and laughed and pointed. Her father finally understood what she was looking at, and there was a moment of intense love between them both. This crow is not a small throwaway moment as it returns in the very last line of the final novel, by the gravestones of Henry and his daughter. From the telephone pole above, a crow cawed twice, then launched itself into the sky with a flurry of wings. Charlotte is tied inextricably to crows, as is the Morrigan. In my opinion, this is not a coincidence. Listen out for them appearing in the games too. Crystal's friend is Kenzie, known by her initials KXT. Same age as Crystal, Kenzie is very different from her friend. Petite and red-haired, she gives a far more relaxed and friendly impression, even veering into playful flirting at times. She's deeply competitive, but with a singular focus, showing no interest at all in beating anyone on the high scoreboard, only interested in defeating Crystal. Kenzie to me is a strong parallel for Baby, from her distinctive hair to her personality. Her singular focus on defeating Crystal is also very reflective of Baby's attitude. In the novels, Baby neglects her instruction from Afton to obtain Charlie and bring her back in favour of a deep sense of competition with the other girl. She cannot come to terms with the fact Charlie was worthy of interest from Henry, while she was not. Their competition at the pinball machines is intense and evenly matched, both of them highly intelligent and very capable at what they do, much as they are in the games. The last major character I'll look at is Finbar. Finbar is an employee of the Pizzaplex and is laid back almost to a fault. He introduces the concept of Irish folklore directly into the story and mentions he's been watching Tony. The entire interaction between Finbar and Tony felt unusual to me. His narrative function within the story appears to be to highlight firmly that GGY's high scores were not obtained due to hacking. But there are aspects of his interaction with Tony that felt intentionally pointed to some larger message or parallel around this character. An example would be the whole section of the conversation where Finbar and Tony finish one another's sentences. Finbar sends away a little girl called Amelia who pitches a huge fit over Fruity Maze and who has a very, very angry moment over being called a princess. Amelia to me has very significant Cassidy impression, giving Cassidy's potential connections to Princess Quest. But taking this into account does not give me too much clarity about who Finbar really represents. I think it could potentially be Henry, but the indicators are not at all strong enough to build certainty on. Tony does point out that Finbar is King of the Fairies, and this at the very least to me ties him to the King in Princess Quest, who is dressed all in red and communicates with the golden-haired princess. Monty Gator and Glamrock Freddy are both present in this story, with Freddy looming ominously in the background watching Tony, and Monty appearing only for a fleeting breakdance cameo. The rest of the characters are fleeting, from the staff at the school to the other children encountered in and around the arcade. For the sake of brevity, I won't go into all of these in depth, though I do consider some of them worthy of a degree of interest. A distinctive feature of this story that sets it apart from many of the others is the opportunity the narrative affords for meta-speculation. The story seems to break the fourth wall on several occasions, with characters making comments which double both as in-world commentary and potential statements about the franchise and story as a whole. In the first line of the story, Tony's teacher writes, "Fiction stretches the boundaries of reality" on the blackboard, and the discussion of fiction versus reality is constantly touched upon in this story. Tony's concerned with taking reality and translating it to word with absolute fidelity, but finds several times that other people can change the nature of his personal reality. In the end, reality itself proves almost stranger than fiction for Tony. Mrs. Soto, his teacher, sets out the goal of the story they have to write for class as focusing on a mystery while also wrapping it in subplots which seem to have nothing to do with the plot but are actually essential to it. This is indeed what they seek to do for their project, but can also be expanded out to describe this entire short story, and then even further out for a potential relationship between the short story series and the game itself. Is it possible that is the role of these stories? To present subplots which appear to be disconnected, but which shed light on the shape of the unseen whole? She reminds her pupils that when writing, they can only let reality spark their imagination, but they must look past the real world. I'm of the opinion that this is Scott's approach with these stories, where the games can provide the spark of inspiration, but the stories deviate off in their own directions. Another potentially entertaining meta commentary in this story is when Greg apologises to Tony at the end. He says, "Boots said you weren't happy with the changes we made to your story. Sorry we did so much to it. We might have gotten carried away, but we were just trying to make it more entertaining." If we take this in the context of the short stories and people's often disproportionate anger at silly storylines, it's quite entertaining. The final sprawling meta comment that comes to mind for me is drawn from a situation Tony describes where he creates his own newspaper as a young child and gets a neighbour in trouble for stealing cable, resulting in his dad's tyres being slashed. After this, his parents tell him he can no longer pass out his stories and urge him to write fiction instead, saying that it's safer. His dad sits down with him and says, "Writing about real life events can be tricky, son. It's hard to get all the facts, and if you don't get them right, or even if you do, you can cause problems for people. Investigative journalism is important to our society, but it can be dangerous." This turns out to be painfully true for Tony in the long run, but also gives us a facet of insight into how dangerous investigating Fazbear Entertainment can be in universe. On a broader level, it's possible to also take this as a comment on how much safer it is to write stories like these about the lore. People can't get angry about what they cannot solidly prove is being said. These tales are fiction upon fiction, another layer of narrative on top of an existing game narrative. The events at Freddy's did not happen, but we find ourselves in a situation where we can almost feel like they did, and that these stories were written to avoid the stark and grim intensity of telling the bloody truth. Mythology is a big ongoing theme throughout the Frights and Tales, with references to numerous world religions and mythologies interwoven with the stories as we progress. The dominant mythology present within GGY is Irish and more broadly Celtic in nature, and there's no ambiguity that this is what's being discussed. Several individuals point out the relevance of their names in an entirely on-the-nose fashion to other characters. Finbar is a version of the name of the king of the Ishi, who are a supernatural race present in various Celtic mythologies, not just Irish. I won't go into the extensive and complex nature of this race, as even their nature as gods, spirits, or ancestors is debated. Essentially, Finbar is associated with harvest and rich rewards for mortals. He's considered benevolent. In contrast, the Morrigan is a complex figure, often represented as a triple goddess, associated with crows and ravens. She's a goddess of war, death, and victory in battle, and as such is not always benevolent in nature. Tying her to Charlotte to me makes perfect sense, as we have a literal depiction of Charliebot as one individual who has many clones, 3 officially in fact, with Baby excluded as a wrong iteration. As previously mentioned, the Morrigan is tied to crows, and in turn, crows are tied to Charlotte. As if this wasn't enough, we have a throwaway headline from Tony's childhood which hilariously aligns with this parallel. It reads, "Crows make off with neighbourhood girl's favourite doll." In the novel trilogy, the original Charlie, housing the spark of life that Henry created from his grief, is his daughter's favourite doll. Also present within this story is the theme of fairy tale characters. Boots sees himself as Puss in Boots, who's popular in modern culture but has his origins in a 1697 fairy tale from Italy and France. He's a cat who uses trickery and deceptiveness to obtain power, wealth, and the heart of a princess. Tony finds himself dubbed Tinkerbell by Boots. Tinkerbell is a commonly seen character in the modern day too. She's of course a fairy from the story by J.M. Barrie. This fairy nature ties the name quite neatly to the fairy lore associated with Finbar and the Morrigan. Tinkerbell is a companion of Peter Pan, who's a little boy who never grows up. The parallels between Peter Pan's unchanging nature and the immortality William Afton seeks, along with the ghost children in the story, are clear. Even Boots is described as never really growing up. I also think this nickname is a sneaky little nod by the authors to the fact that Tony is with Greg, someone who could be paralleled with Peter Pan. If certain theories are to be believed, he could indeed be a child who never grows up. Another connection to Tinkerbell is found in the fourth closet, where William Afton himself directly references pixie dust when discussing Remnant. He runs his hand over the metal amalgam creature that he's created and explains that in order to unlock the unlimited potential, a drop of pixie dust must be applied to a creation you only mostly control like a robot, versus absolute control like a mechanism. This direct comparison between Remnant and pixie dust was something I always found curious. The theme of GGY certainly seems to me to be fact versus fiction, and all the nuances tied up in this. We have a narrator who is subtly flawed, and we're limited in turn by his perspective. This is fully intentional and also important for what is functionally a mystery story. We find things out as Tony does. A unique feature of the written word is that the reader is completely blinkered by the perception of the character we're given. If there are details we might pick up on but the protagonist would not, these are concealed from us by the nature of writing itself. This makes for a compelling but sometimes frustrating read. I think all in all the theme is portrayed well here, and does raise many questions about the larger storyline and Security Breach in particular. There are many mysteries around the game and its endings, and in the wake of this story there are many more. Tony seems to have found a truth that suits him, but is this the truth that we seek? In the end, we're not even 100% sure that Greg is actually GGY. We're not given the satisfaction of seeing what happens to Tony or how the missing therapists even met their fate. We're left with more questions than answers, just like Tony. Now we come to the crux of this particular story. What does it tell us about the games? Firstly, I have to address the two extremes of thought that I'm aware of in regards to the Tales for the Pizzaplex and novels in general. There's one side of the scale that want the novels to be a one-to-one representation of the games, where whatever happens in the stories is representative of what is also happening in the games. There's another extreme which dismisses the books as just nonsense, useless for the lore, completely detached from everything, text in a void. I disagree firmly with both of these extremes. As far as I'm concerned, the stories are in an alternative continuity until 100% proven otherwise, but have completely valid things to say about the real story. The Pizzaplex in GGY is meticulously depicted as having various areas from the games, such as the Fazcade, which is depicted accurately down to the arcade machine names and DJ Music Man. Other areas for the games are also mentioned, such as Bonnie Ball and Roxy Raceway. However, it's worth mentioning that the Pizzaplex in this story also contains a roller coaster and climbing tubes, which one could assume are the same ones we see in the other Tales stories. It's not an exact replica of the game. The question of the time period Security Breach occurs is another question which looms over the fandom. I deviate from popularly accepted thought and consider the game itself takes place far closer to the modern day than 2030 or 40. I have plenty of reasons for why I think this, ranging from the calendars and whiteboard dates to the accepted technology of the era. However, the game's timeline is only tangentially relevant here. In the context of GGY itself, I believe the story takes place around 2013. There are two reasons for this. Morrigan99 is a typical naming convention online where people use their birth year as trailing numbers. This implies that this is Crystal's year of birth. She's stated as a sophomore, which would make her 15 to 16 and would set the story then. To support this, the first place that people go in this era for discussion is website forums rather than social media. Forums are in decline in the modern era. They were not in decline to the same extent in 2013. Trying to set the story in the future renders many elements anachronistic. Another strange parallel with the game is at the very beginning of the story while Tony's sitting in class and looking out the window. He thinks that he sees someone falling down through the rain. He's alarmed at what he sees as the only thing Tony could have seen out in the rain, 45 feet above the ground, was something falling or flying. Later in the passage, he decides that what he saw was a branch from one of the trees, but this mental image is not returned to in the story itself. It does, however, parallel one of the most curious endings of Security Breach. In the ending where we leave through the VIP area, Freddy sets fire to the Pizzaplex and heads to the roof where Vanny grabs Freddy. Both of them fall off the roof. This is not a clear or direct correlation, but is one that struck me as interesting given that this particular narrative thread in the story is not picked up again. In Security Breach, we find retro CDs, which can be found throughout the game. These appear to catalogue the interaction between two individuals, 71 and 46. Patient 71 is introduced as Vanessa and is assumed to parallel the Vanessa we know in game, while Patient 46 is a huge mystery. What matters in this section, however, is the number of distinct therapists we encounter through these CDs. From what we can ascertain, there are 4, which aligns with the number of missing therapists in the story if we assume there is a 4th now working at the school. Again, to deviate from what we have in the games, the therapists in the CDs that we find are working for Fazbear Entertainment, not a local school. So once again, we have a clear difference between the games and this particular story. As a final entertaining little aside, Tony wonders to himself, who was this arcade phenom? Linking the character of GGY to the in-game CDs where a therapist specifically describes Patient 46 as something of a phenom and compliments their hacking. So, in conclusion, what do I think that GGY has to say about the games? As I've mentioned before, I don't think there's a direct correlation between the games and the literature. I think the books are an alternate universe which gives us some tools to understand aspects of the game canon. Is there a possibility that the Gregory we know in the games is a darker figure than people suspected? Absolutely. Does this mean that Gregory is absolutely Patient 46? No. There's a lot of speculation about the identity of Patient 46, with people strenuously stating that it cannot be Gregory due to the gender assigned to the character in international localizations. I would argue this could have been a decision taken arbitrarily, and that it does not disprove or prove anything. Ultimately, I don't think GGY tells us anything definitively. I think that Patient 46 could very well still be Charlotte, who's present in this story alongside Gregory, and the whole thing is a red herring. Or it could be informing us that there's a lot more to Gregory than we assume, and that he's part of the larger infiltration of the Pizzaplex. The fact that Glamrock Freddy appears to be used as GGY's eyes and ears when he's not around lends further credence to the connection between the sinister events at the Pizzaplex and GGY and the events of Security Breach, where GGY appears to enlist Freddy into his service. Like any of the other stories in this series, I think that GGY is a tool we are given to help us cast light on the shape of the narrative of the stories. I enjoyed reading this little mystery and hope that it has helped to consider it in more depth. Feel free to leave your comments below, like and subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you all in the next book club video. Thanks.